The Uses of Enchantment by Heidi Julavits. Narrated by Shelly Frasier. Copyright 2006 by Heidi Julavits. This audiobook is published by arrangement with Heidi Julavits and Dunno, Carlson, and Lerner, and was produced in year 2006 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. What Might Have Happened, November 7, 1985. The following might have happened on a late fall afternoon in the Boston suburb of West Salem. The afternoon in question was biting enough to suggest the early possibility of snow. The cloud cover made it seem later than the actual time of 3:35 p.m. The girl was one of many girls in field hockey skirts, sweatpants, and ski shells, huddled together in the green lean-to emblazoned with Semmering Academy's scripted S. It had rained all morning and all afternoon. Though the rain had temporarily ceased, the playing field remained a patchwork of brown grass and mud, bordered by a rain-swept chalk line. Last month, the Semmering wing had torn an ankle tendon in similarly poor conditions, but the referee refused to call the game until 4 p.m., because the Preparatory School Extracurricular Activities Rules and Regulations Handbook stipulated that sporting events shall not be canceled due to weather until 1 hour past the official start time. At 3:37, the rain recommenced. The girls whined and shivered while Coach Betsy glowered beneath the brim of her UMass Crew baseball cap. These girls were not tough girls, and they had little incentive, given their 8-game losing streak, to endure a rainy November afternoon. At 3:42, the girl asked Coach Betsy if she could be excused to the field house. The girl did not say, but she implied that she had her period. Coach Betsy nodded her reluctant permission. The girl departed from the lean-to, unnoticed by her teammates. Rain pattered over the grass as the girl traversed the empty field, her cleats suctioning in and out of the mud. She did not hurry. The man, she knew, would wait for her. Every afternoon the man parked across the street from the cemetery where she and her friends escaped after lunch to smoke cigarettes. At first they thought he was an undercover cop or truant officer, someone hired by their headmaster, Miss Pym, to keep tabs on their forbidden roaming during school hours. But the man's car, a 1975 gray Mercedes, rendered this suspicion unlikely. He'd since been downgraded to probable pervert and treated by the girls as their mascot, rallying proof of their irresistibility. The girl made sure to pause each day in his line of vision to adjust her knee sock or swing her Semmering issue skirt around so that the rear knife pleat snapped back and forth like a school of fish when she walked. She had noticed that, as the weeks of fall progressed, as the trees became more and more naked and the humid tropical haze over the cemetery thinned to an astringent veneer, the man stopped watching in his non-watching way the anonymous passing of girls and focused on one girl in particular. This should have been thrill enough. The girl entered the new field house. She meandered down the empty halls with their long fluorescent tube lighting and glassed-in trophy cases. She pushed through the swinging olive-green door into the olive-green locker room with the olive-green tiles and the pervasive smell of pink hand soap. She stood in front of the mirror. She applied some lip balm, but otherwise did nothing to improve her appearance. She was wet, she was bedraggled, and like all teenagers after a half-hearted day of French, trigonometry, study hall, drama, field hockey, she was in desperate need of a ride and a greasy meal, two very innocent things to want, even from a stranger. She spun her locker combination. She propped her field hockey stick inside her locker and removed her book bag. Then she changed her mind, replacing her book bag, removing her stick. On her way toward the front doors of the field house, she stopped in front of the 30-foot-long mural dominating the lobby. Miss Pym and the Semmering trustees, after securing the funds for the new field house, had announced a mural contest in which entries should illustrate, with reference to our area's rich past, the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of New England women. The winning mural depicted women being chased by tomahawk-wielding Indians and women tied to stakes, their skirt hems blotted by flames fanning upward from crudely rendered piles of logs. The clouds above the heads of the soon-to-be scalped or burned women transformed, with a little squinting and very little imagination, into faces that surveyed the scene with expressions commonly interpreted as enthusiasm. To the handful of actively feminist teachers at Semmering, these possibly enthusiastic clouds were read as a perverse endorsement of injustice against women by the school's trustees, who noted their complaint as a way to actively ignore it. The mural's official title, The Disappearing Women, was all but unknown among the student body, who referred to the 30-foot wall painting as the Grin and Bear It mural. To them, it aptly summed up the way they had been taught to approach the world by parents and teachers, to keep their sadness to themselves, even as they were materially spoiled in this suburban enclave, with its lurid history of torment. The girl walked past the Grin and Bear It mural, heart beating at an average pace, the disappearing women gazing down at her with their irisless eyes. She exited the field house and walked 3 blocks north to the cemetery. She saw the man's gray Mercedes parked near the stone archway, the engine running, windshield wipers chick-chocking back and forth. The rain had increased its intensity, the patter giving way to pelting drops that formed puddles and then rivers as the water slushed toward the leaf-clogged drains. The girl took her time. Water dripped from her nose and her chin and the hem of her skirt, soaking a perfect dark line across the thighs of her sweatpants. Her cleats made squinching noises as she walked. So little light seeped through the clouds at 3:59 p.m. that the street lamps buzzed and ignited. She sidled next to the Mercedes. By the car's interior light, she could see the man's head bent over his newspaper. His hair fell longer than the collar of his scruffy trench coat, and this slight unkemptness suggested that he was not indispensable to any job or any one. The girl had decided that he was a banker, or possibly a doctor, but an undedicated one. She decided that he had enough family money that his profession was simply a decent way to keep his days occupied. There were plenty of men like this in her town. He was an identifiable and harmless type. The girl paused in the ambient light shining through the Mercedes window, illuminated, she imagined, like a beguiling specter. The man pretended not to see her. How coy, she thought. It increased her fondness for him, the fact that he was treating this abduction like a formal courtship. Using the upturned goose head of her field hockey stick, she tapped on the glass. The man stared at her. He reached over his newspaper to roll down the window. The girl leaned into the car. She smelled old cigarette smoke and damp carpets. Close up, the man appeared more tired, more old, more possibly crazy. She coughed, momentarily unsettled by the fact that this man might not be who she'd imagined him to be. She clamped her neck with the U formed by her thumb and forefinger, the way her mother did when talking to someone she disliked at a cocktail party, squeezing her fingers tightly around her own throat. The girl asked if he had a dime. No response. For the payphone, she explained. Her ride had left without her, and home was too far a walk in the rain. He responded with cautious politeness, which she read as bewildered gratitude to some unspecified higher power that this girl should walk into a trap he had yet to even set. "I'll drive you home," he said. He unlocked the passenger side door, sprung the latch. The girl scurried through his headlights. She paused on the curb as the opposing team's athletic bus drove by. It was 4:05 by Semmering steeple clock, and the game had finally been postponed, to ensure that somebody might witness her getting into the car. Just in case, she dropped her field hockey stick into the gutter, where it would be recovered and remarked upon by journalists and police, family, friends, teachers. She grasped the door handle and experienced a fleeting sensation of fear, an electrical charge that caused her fingers to retract into a self-protective claw. She imagined, because she was dramatically inclined, that the handle was burning hot, that her body was on fire, that she was immolating from within and her cells were being set individually ablaze because she, too, fancied herself to be a disappearing woman, her eyes a blank white stare. West Salem, November 8, 1999. Once again, Mary Veal found herself the aggressively unnoticed guest at a tense social gathering at the house on Rumney Marsh. Once again, she wore a hand-me-down wool dress that itched horribly and smelled like a closet. Her father was nowhere to be seen. The punch bowl provided the conversational focal point. Once again, her sisters were snubbing her. Once again, the hors d'oeuvres were lame. Mum's funeral notwithstanding, she reflected, it felt just like old times. From behind her plaid wingback redoubt, she watched as her older sister Regina, ruddy hair flanked flat by a headband and thinner than her usual thin, listlessly orbited the downstairs. Her younger sister Gabby hunched on the piano bench, wearing a tight navy pantsuit that made her look like a down-and-out real estate agent. Gabby picked vacantly at her paper plate of grapes and salmon mousse Triscuits. She appeared, Mary thought, in need of an awkward social encounter with an estranged family member. A wary Gabby clocked Mary's approach with her green-brown mum eyes. "Nice suit," Mary offered. "Mum's," Gabby said through a mouthful of grape. "It fits you," Mary said. She fingered the empty candy dish atop the piano, its circumference encircled by a green ribbon. This elicited no response from Gabby. "Except for the pants. And the jacket." Said Gabby. "It fits nicely around the wrists," Mary said. The two of them wordlessly observed the arriving guests clot into special interest groups around the punch bowl. Mum's sister Helen and their handful of local cousins. Mum's Historical Society co-workers, Mum's Wellesley College Alumni Association friends, Mum's former Semmering Academy PTA colleagues. The wake felt uncomfortably overseen from the mantel by Mum herself, her ashes stowed in a Laotian dung vase forced upon them by Aunt Helen and flanked by two florist arrangements of pussy willows and weedy-looking filler plants. Regina completed one last enervated rotation and dropped onto the piano bench beside Gabby. She folded her legs and coiled her left foot around her right ankle, a holdover gesture from adolescence. She'd claimed once to Mary that this tourniquet pose helped to stave off weight gain, at least in the leg area, which seemed about as reasonable as believing in the slimming powers of the electric massage belt. Mary remained determined to forge an emotional connection with her sisters. "How about that sermon?" Mary said, referring to Reverend Whitmore's selection from the New Testament. "For one believes he can eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables." Offered, she suspected, as biblical proof that their mother's subsistence diet of white wine and pickles had been a more decisive element in her demise than the melanoma. "He reads that sermon at every funeral," Regina said. "Once he called the dead person, who was a man, beloved Phyllis." Gabby yawned. "Do you remember in junior choir how Reverend Whitmore smelled like embalming fluid?" Regina said. "The old perv was always hugging me after we sang praise him, saying, 'How the heavens applaud you, my dear.'" "Blick," Gabby said through shards of Triscuit. "At least Aunt Helen almost made it through her poem without crying," Mary said. She didn't mention Regina's poem, written specifically for Mum's funeral. The most truthful response she could muster, as she and Regina and Gabby waited for Dad to bring the car around after the service, had been, "It was so brave of you to read that." Or plugging her herbal grief tea, Regina said. "I thought Healthy Acceptance filed for bankruptcy," Mary said. "Dad bailed her out, which is why we have 17 cases of grief tea in the attic," Regina said. "Where have you been?" "Oh, right, you were out west." "When Aunt Helen cries," Mary said, ignoring the dig, "I wonder how anyone could ever appear convincingly sad." "Which I guess explains why you didn't even bother to try," Regina said. "Gabby, where did you get that awful suit?" "Mum's closet," Gabby said. "Is grief tea supposed to make you feel grief or make you not feel it?" "Not feel grief," Mary said dully. "I think." "That's not Mum's suit," Regina said. "Mum hated navy." Gabby turned her suit coat inside out to reveal a green ribbon tied to the dry clean only tag. Their father had donated the house's contents to the Historical Society for auctioning, and an overly apologetic volunteer had come around the previous day to tag the desirable items with ribbons. To be safe, the volunteer had overdone the job, or maybe, given she knew the wake was to be held at 34 Romney Marsh, she saw herself doubling as decorator for the occasion. All 4 legs of the couch were adorned with ribbon, both andirons, both candlesticks, the lamp bases and the lamp shades, and even the spare box of light bulbs. Every individual kitchen item, egg beater, potato masher, potato peeler, wine key, the collection of circa 1979 to 1983 Association of Descendants of the American Witch newsletters stacked beneath the rattan coffee table. "So," Regina said, "speaking of not feeling grief, has anyone checked on Dad recently?" "I'll go," Mary offered, relieved to escape the hostile tedium of her sister's company. It depressed her too immensely and made her feel abrased by an all-body loneliness. In the 3 years since Mary and Regina and Gabby had been together in the same room, nothing had changed. She tried to rekindle the heart-wrenching warmth she'd imagined feeling toward her sisters as she walked down the airplane exit ramp to their teary reunion, but instead found herself irked by Regina's self-centered prickliness and Gabby's wrathful apathy. Despite how she'd envisioned this homecoming, horribly sad, yes, stilted, yes, but glinting with the potential for everyone to recast themselves as expansively generous and affectionate people, the remaining Veal family members, herself included, hadn't really shown themselves capable of improvement. Mary passed through the living room, her mobile presence registered only by the way the guests she neared strived to more actively ignore her. She split the curtains behind the punch table, expecting to see her father, Clyde Veal, still stationed on the front lawn directing parking, but he'd abandoned his post. Since his departure, guests had parked along the north side of the street, ignoring the flyers he'd taped to the street lamps in order to avoid the territorial wrath of the neighbor Mum had christened Ye Old Bastard. Eventually she found him, fingers pittering against his key-filled pockets, waiting in the foyer to receive coats, even though people had long since stopped arriving. "Dad," she started to say, but the two of them had pointedly arranged never to be alone without a chaperone since her arrival, so, in fairness to him, she chose to check on Dad from behind the broken grandfather clock. He opened the door and peered down the street, as if expecting a cavalcade of mourners to turn onto Rumney Marsh and invade the house in desperate need of a coat-check attendant. Her father hadn't invited any of his work acquaintances from St. Hugh's today, nor any of his golf cronies from the public golf range, a non-selective, dress-code-free club overlooking a swamp that boasted, among its members, a gay couple and an acquitted child abuser. Her father maintained his connection with the local working-class community while respecting Mum's unspoken hope that these people never be invited to their house. So it was in deference to Mum, she assumed, that he'd failed to invite his friends, or it was for some more complicated, self-defeating reason. Mary knew without ever needing to be told. Her father was a self-made, lonely man. She would tell her sisters when they asked how he was, "Dad is Dad." This diagnosis, transferably applicable to all of them, they would understand. Mary returned to the living room, dodging the 2 hors d'oeuvres platters wielded at her neck height by the waspy widowed caterers. Did even they refuse to see her? How many years had it been? A stupid question. She knew how many years. Everyone in the room knew how many years. 14 years to the day. The waspy widowed caterers offered toothpicks and colored finger napkins to the guests, who seemed relieved to be interrupted from their non-conversations. People emptied their cups of gin punch so that they could get a refill and have something to do. Not that funeral receptions were judged by the same standards as other social gatherings, but even given Mary's exceptionally low expectations for this event, it was proving to be a dud. Though not a regular smoker, Mary needed a cigarette. "Excuse me," Mary said to Fran Bigelow, Mum's tennis partner and a relentless chimney, currently hurrying past her en route to the bathroom. Mrs. Bigelow, such hand-eye, she remembered Mum marveling, sprung sideways as though Mary had attempted to stab her with an hors d'oeuvre fork. As Mrs. Bigelow continued to move in a diagonal vector at a near-tripping pace, her heel caught in the loop of green ribbon extending from the handle of the decorative coal hod. Her heel acted like a catapult. Her next forward step hurled the coal hod into the fireplace, where the hod cleanly picked off both andirons and landed on its side with a deafening crash. Conversations halted. "Whoopsie," Mrs. Bigelow said, staring damningly at Mary. Mary froze. She, who had been previously so invisible, was suddenly aggressively seen. Mum's Wellesley College Alumni Association friends, Mum's Semmering Academy PTA colleagues, Mum's Historical Society co-workers, the spouses, the distant cousins, all of them eyed her with a familiar blank probity. Exuberantly, she returned their gazes. She'd forgotten how enjoyable it was to dislike these people, and was invigorated by the reminder. Cocktail parties notwithstanding, their preferred pastime was making others feel eternally shitty about themselves, these emotionally mummified, blank-eyed, sorry people. How easy it was to blame them for her troubles with her mother, how much easier it was to blame them than to blame a more deserving party, herself, for example. She rewarded the lot of them with a grotesquely buoyant smile. "Strike!" she said. In the hallway, her father stifled a hiccup. Aunt Helen, 3, maybe 4 drinks deep into the afternoon, rushed from the kitchen, silk skirt thudding on her apparent wind as she pincered Mary by the elbow and steered her to a vacant space near the punch bowl. A gossipy buzz engulfed them. "Not recommended today," Aunt Helen said. "Irreverence." "I couldn't help it," Mary lied. "It's what Mum would have said." Aunt Helen refilled her punch glass. Her wardrobe clashed as loudly as her interest in curative teas and gin drinks, a silk icac skirt blandified by a gum-colored twin set, and a gold frog pin from the local purveyor of Preppy, the House of Walsh. "Also not recommended today," she said. "Presuming to speak for your mother." "You're one to talk," Mary wanted to say, but didn't. Aunt Helen was a shadowy pro at expressing her own feelings by attributing them to others. Usually she employed her standard poodle, Ouija, for this purpose, to wit, "Ouija's feeling neglected today, isn't he?" But today Ouija was with her neighbors, and Aunt Helen needed a Ouija surrogate. Mary apparently fit the bill. "Not that your extreme inappropriateness isn't understandable. You must be devastated," said Aunt Helen. "Refusing to see you before she died. That's just so Paula, isn't it? She didn't give 2 hoots about anyone's feelings except her own." "What can you expect from terminally ill conflict avoiders?" Mary said lightly. The truth was she'd been blindsided by her mother's refusal to see her, expecting, as inane as it sounded, to share some sort of pablum closure moment with her in the Lillian P. Rudy Memorial Cancer Wing, as the candy stripers wept and the oncologist did a mournful soft shoe, and her mother, the most pablum-free individual on the planet, clasped her hand and said, This is where the absurdity of her fantasy overrode the actual fantasy, which didn't mean the failure of the fantasy to be met, to ever be met, hadn't left her feeling bludgeoned. "You must be angry with her," Aunt Helen said. "I imagine you're very, very angry." Aunt Helen widened her smudgy eyes tellingly, then shudder gulped twice in rapid succession, before appearing to cease breathing altogether. She released Mary's elbow and waved at her. Mary stared, bewildered, until she realized Aunt Helen wanted her cocktail napkin. Aunt Helen exhaled loudly, using the napkin to dab at her tearless face. Across the room, Mary saw Regina and Gabby exchange a look that told her they were bonding over the hating of other people. Aunt Helen, Mary, even their own father, who had excused himself from his non-existent coat-check duties. Now he was playing with the second cousin's baby beneath the portrait of Mum's 8th great-grandmother, Abigail Lake, a suspected witch executed at Gallows Hill in 1692, and yet to be officially pardoned by the state of Massachusetts, and, notably, the only item in the living room without a green ribbon. Baby as grief shield, Mary thought. No funeral should be without a baby. Her father bounced the baby on his knee. He fake-walked it across the carpet. He absent-mindedly played with its left ear, squashing it in half and unsquashing it at seemingly intentional intervals, as though he were sending Morse code to a guest across the room. She watched as Regina approached their father and asked him if he'd like another punch. He smiled toward a longitude of unoccupied airspace. He'd been smiling at no one in particular since he woke up that morning, surrounded by an aggressively chipper force field that repelled all attempts at human connection. Maxie and Susan, Mum's former Wellesley roommates, ladies who lunch vipers and the only 2 people Mary had been pointedly avoiding herself that afternoon, stood proprietorially to the left of the portrait of Abigail Lake. The portrait, frequent target of family scorn, and the only item, according to her will, that Paula Abigail Bowden Veal had left to her 3 daughters, was painted to look like an antique, but was in fact less than 10 years old, inspired by a passage Mum found in a diary describing her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's walk to the gallows. Flat and gray of eye, the diarist wrote, expressionless mouth, in which the words of a pretty devil lurk. The painting was a money-making scam, in Mary's opinion, cooked up by Susan's feminist artist daughter, a former classmate of Mary's at Semmering Academy, who offered, for an absurd fee, to paint portraits of the gallows victims, to honor those who have been so long dishonored. Susan's daughter had interpreted the diary description of Abigail Lake to produce a woman who, according to Regina and Gabby, resembled nobody so much as she resembled Mary in a bonnet. Maxie held a paper plate of grapes. Susan nursed a sweating glass of seltzer. Both women were rickety and unseasonably brown, their chests and arms so sun-spotted they appeared upholstered in a miniature leopard print. They flashed Mary grins so intense that it only confirmed her formerly paranoid suspicion that they'd been discussing her.
"How's life in Montana?"
asked Maxie.
"Oregon,"
corrected Susan.
"You moved to Oregon?"
said Maxie.
"She's always lived in Oregon,"
said Susan.
"You're still a waitress?"
asked Maxie.
"She's a secretary,"
said Susan. "I work in the admissions office of a private girls' school outside Portland," Mary said. Work was either an understatement or an overstatement. She was more of a professional calmer of buttoned-up hysterics, the bulk of her actual job consisting of talking down the mothers whose daughters were rejected from Beaverton's Grove School, mothers who charged into her office holding the "due to the high quality of applicants" letter like a pair of damning panties pulled from a husband's blazer pocket. Like Semmering Academy, the Grove School was a Gothic pile of bricks run by 1950s-era chalk drones, which maintained its cultural viability by perpetuating a weirdly seductive anxiety throughout its community. Mary herself was a victim of the seduction. Despite the trying and repetitive emotional requirements of her job, she remained eternally fascinated by the wicker-thin girls and their wicker-thin mothers, all of them favoring dark wool skirts and macintoshes and unreadably faraway expressions. If she squinted, they could have emerged intact from any of the last 7 decades. The past and the present ghosted together in the hallways of the Grove School, and maybe that was why she worked there. When the halls were abandoned for the day and the sound of rain thrumming on the slate roof blur red with the far-off screech of coaches' whistles, she could imagine she herself had been ghosted, that she'd been sucked back to a crucial crossroads in her own life and offered a second chance. "I work at a private girls' school," she repeated.
"Do you?"
said Maxie dryly.
"That's odd,"
said Susan. Silence. All 3 looked at Clyde, holding the baby upside down by the ankles, yelling, "Adios, little moon man!" Then,
"Terrible about the obituary,"
said Susan. Mary assumed they were referring to the headline, "Daughter of Early American Witch Dies." She hadn't read more than that.
"So tasteless,"
said Maxie.
"Newspapers can't pass up an opportunity for scandal,"
said Susan.
"Referring to her as Miriam's mother, the gall of those people."
Mary blanched. Miriam's mother.
"That book ruined her life,"
Maxie said tonelessly.
"And such exquisitely bad timing for the funeral,"
Susan said.
14 years to the day, Maxie said. "Imagine the coincidence."
Susan's and Maxie's skulls quivered atop their reedy necks, like the tips of dowsing rods, veering toward hidden watery areas under the green-ribboned Persian. Mary noticed people checking their watches, and the other guests, as if searching for a silently agreed-upon cue that they'd mourned enough in their bucked-up way and were allowed to go home for dinner. Mary faked a coughing fit and pointed at her throat with one hand while miming a drinking gesture with the other. She escaped to the punch bowl where there was no more punch, and where her fake coughing fit intensified into an actual coughing fit. Eyes watering, Mary hurried toward the kitchen for a glass of water, but was stopped in the foyer by Aunt Helen.
"Ouija's tired,"
Aunt Helen announced, her words punctured. She retrieved her vase from the mantel, having transferred her sister's ashes to the silverware drawer. After informing Mary of Paula's new whereabouts, she grasped Mary's wrist with a cadaverish hand.
"Mimsy,"
she said. When she pronounced it like that, mimsy, nasal, and high-pitched, Mary was reminded of Regina's favorite childhood goad, that her nickname was not a sweet diminutive inspired by her early life littleness. In fact, it came from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky and was a hybrid concoction of flimsy and miserable.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?